the keyboard to the boardroom, this is the Business of Esports. From the keyboard to the boardroom, this is the Business of Esports Podcast. I am Paul the Prophet Dawalibi. I'm joined today by my friend and co-host, the Honorable Judge Jimmy Baratta. For those of you who are new here, welcome to the official podcast of esports. What we do is we cover the most pressing game and esports topics and news of the week, but we look at all of it through a business and C-suite lens. We dissect, we analyze the business implications of everything happening in this industry. For our regular listeners, thank you guys for tuning in every week. Thank you for all the 5-star ratings and reviews, all the love you give the podcast. I promise we read all of them. It's also humbling. Thank you so much if you've left a 5-star rating and review somewhere on the podcast. If you haven't yet, go leave one, or even better, share the podcast with a friend, a colleague, someone you know who's interested in the industry. We really appreciate it. Jimmy, how you doing this week?
Having a great week, Paul. Happy to be back. How's it going, listeners? It's podcast day. Let's get into it.
Jimmy, you know, I'm sorry if I sound a little hoarse. I don't know what it is about Dubai at this time of year, but there's literally a conference every week for like the next 8 weeks. I'm sad you're not here. Like, I don't have my conference wingman. You know, I think we're a great duo at conferences because I talk a little bit on stage and then you do all the hard work afterward.
That's why you miss having me. It's because you don't have to work at the conferences when I'm there. I would love to be there too, Paul. But I have TwitchCon this Friday. I'm super excited to go down to San Diego for that. We got Esports Business Summit that's coming out here in Las Vegas in November. I'll be going to Atlanta for Todd Harris's, one of our former guests, and obviously a legend in the industry. He's having a huge business summit in Atlanta right up to DreamHack. So, that's how we're going to have to divide and conquer these things, I think. You're going to have to work at some of them sometimes.
This is so much better when you were doing all the legwork and collecting business cards and talking to people and doing the networking and the relationship stuff. Me having to do this now feels like I have to do a real job. I mean, it's just weird.
Well, I think what you need is a handler, because if anyone has seen Paul live at a conference, he's just like on the live show, just like on the podcast, no holds barred, I think is the expression. And it's just a flood of people that come up to talk to him after the panel because they're so intrigued and find it so humorous that he didn't pull any punches on stage for any reason.
I was speaking today, we record on Wednesdays. I was speaking today at the World Metaverse Show in Dubai, and I had 2 panels on the intersection of gaming and metaverse, which is obviously a lot of the things we talk about on, Business of Esports and general holodeck content. And I will say, I had a moderator on one of the panels who cut me off like 2 times, which was is like, I couldn't even believe what was happening. I mean, I was like in the middle of making a great point. But what was interesting is I'm amazed at the amount of non-gaming metaverse discussion. I'm almost like bothered by it. Like, and this is a rabbit hole, but I just spent the whole day there, so I want to get it off my chest. It's like, who cares about going to pay your parking tickets in the metaverse, right? Like, does anyone really care to do that? Like, isn't the website just better for that? I don't know. I feel like in some cases we've got too far away from what really this should all be about, which should be about the fun and the gaming. And everyone knows fun is sort of my entire mantra. But it was interesting to see, right? Like, there's just so much discussion around it that's not gaming related, and I don't know if any of it's really going to come to bear. But a good reminder to go tune in. Make sure you listen to our Meta Business podcast, Meta Woman podcast, especially, and follow like Metaverse TV on a whole bunch of our socials. There's more like Metaverse content there than you would find directly with Business of Esports. Now, a guy who may have an opinion on the metaverse, may have an opinion on a lot of things, but someone I'm super excited to have on the podcast is our guest this week, Daniel Marcus, who is the founding partner at Hustle Law and a professor of esports at NYU. Daniel, welcome to the Business of Esports podcast.
Thanks, guys. I have a question for you because I'm listening to start off.
Oh, great.
You mentioned
the day of people cutting me off and asking.
No. I think this is good. So when you mentioned you guys go to a lot of conferences, like what's the first question you always get asked at a conference or like any sort of networking event? What's the first question? There's only one right answer here, by the way.
I mean, it depends. I mean, that's a bit tough question because is it a gaming conference or is it a metaverse conference? Because these days, these are very different crowds. I find at these two kinds of events.
I don't think it matters. I think there's only one there's always one question everyone gets asked first.
What is it? I'm curious.
Yeah,
you tell me,
Jimmy. What is it?
What is it? That's the question, right? What is it? What is the metaverse?
It's always without fail. What do you do? And I always find that like it's a very cut to the chase kind of question. Whereas like I like small talk, right? Like let's evolve.
You want to be romanced and seduced.
Buy me some dinner first. So I've been trying to elevate my small talk. But I've also been sourcing different like quips or retorts for that question. And the best one I heard recently, Julie, I forget her last name, but Julie does a lot of stuff with NFTs in the metaverse. She was like, when people ask me what do, I tell them I do my best, which I was like, I like that. I'm gonna start using it.
But that kills the conversation. Just like it's hard to come back from that. I feel like, or maybe it creates conversation. I don't know.
I think it creates conversation. It weeds out the people you want to talk to versus the ones that don't have a sense of humor. So, Daniel,
you're going to be disappointed here though, because the first question on this podcast is always some version of what do you do? But I want to get the origin story here, the Daniel Marcus origin story, right? Like, what got you into gaming and esports? What is the, give me a bit of the background, how you got to here, and some of the stuff you're focused on now. I'm sorry, we're gonna have to cut to the chase. There's only there's no small talk.
I think you figured out a way to ask it in an artful way. So I think that's important. So the narrative version, I guess, in the relatively succinct way to tell it is, I went to school for sports business, period. I didn't think it would be esports. I was an undergrad. I was an undergrad at NYU sports business program where I now teach. And when I was there, I did a bunch of different things. The first thing I ever did professionally was write. So I covered my two favorite traditional sports teams, which were the New York Jets, which is unfortunate, and the New York Yankees, a little bit more fortunate. For Sportsnet New York, which is the Mets television station. So that I wrote for their digital side. Ended up at 19 getting credentialed. Talking to Tim Tebow in the locker room, and it was the Tim Tebow Jets. Covering the later years, Mariano Rivera, Derek Jeter Yankees, also as a credentialed media member. So that was great. And ended up becoming the sports director at the FM radio station at NYU, which is 89.1 WNYU. And I was given my own half-hour radio show. So doing like audio, radio, podcasts, this is giving me nostalgia right now because it's something I haven't done in a little bit. But, I had my own show and I ran the sports division at NYU, which was all student run until I got fired in a coup d'etat, which was like a big just this dispute or culture clash between like the hipster college radio crowd and the sports people, which was myself and all my friends that I had assembled. But I guess that was kind of a blessing because when I was a junior, I ended up starting my first company, which was called Seat Swap, which was in the event ticketing space. Knew I wanted to do that for a while, had the time to do it because I was like, well, I got fired from this job, so I might as well create my own one. And pulled together a team, didn't really know what I was doing. And as we were writing our first lines of code, I got a full scholarship offer to law school, including books and a trip to London. And I have a very pushy Jewish mother who's actually in the other room right now because it's a holiday. So this is why I'm not on video, who was like, the nice version was, "You're an idiot, you should take it." And so I took her advice. She was right about that. Ended up bootstrapping that company through law school while pursuing my JD full time. And when I was there, we did a lot of good things, picked up a lot of traction. I got in front of Carnegie Hall, which, for those that aren't familiar, obviously like one of the most famous venues in all of music and performing arts in New York, to pitch them an enterprise product before I even had a semblance of a consumer product to talk about. And I was 21, and it was hilarious if you think about it. And so the classic joke is like, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice. Another way to get to Carnegie Hall is a little bit of hustle and sending cold emails. So fast forward through this story, I ended up graduating law school in the summer of 2017. When I was supposed to be studying for the bar, we really started to pick up momentum, and I found out that my company was in the final round of an accelerator that was started by the Adidas family. So there's an accelerator called LEAD, which you guys might be familiar with just from the esports and gaming space. Stands for Legacy of Adi Dassler, who, if you know Adidas, Adi Dassler, there's named after him. And so his lineals started a sports tech accelerator, incubator, and a fund. And they were like, "We want you to come out to Berlin." And I said, "Great, as long as you pay for it." And so they ended up paying for it at the last minute. And I went, and when I should have been studying for the bar. And so out of 450 companies, they cut the fields to 40, and I was in that top 40. And then it was like 3 days of startup speed dating, very German. 20 minutes, blow a whistle, talk to someone else. 20 minutes, someone else, blow a whistle. And then so they cut the field in half to 20. Top 15 got in. Long story short, I was in the top 20. So I didn't end up getting into the final round or part of that initial cohort, but that's fine because I didn't want to move to Berlin anyway. Come back, and I get a LinkedIn message from the CEO of what was then probably the third largest secondary ticketing company in the States, who said, "Hey, listen, I read an op-ed that you wrote, and I got permission from my board to roll up a couple of companies in the space. Would you want to have that conversation?" And so just picture you're me right now. You're 25. You don't really want to be a lawyer. Like, that was the law degree was free, so I had no designs of being a lawyer. And the prospect of taking a company like you put a little money into, but a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and being acqui-hired and living in Marina Del Rey for a couple of years. Due respect to Southern California, Jimmy, not the biggest fan of LA, but it wasn't the worst outcome.
Me
So
either.
did the whole song and dance with their C-suite. Demos, etc., only to find out that company was hemorrhaging cash and they went out of business 3 months later. And I was like, "Oh shit, I got to figure something out." So ended up taking the bar, eventually passing. Didn't want to be a lawyer, so I worked for a guy named Steve Gottlieb for like my first job right out of law school, and he had created a Zoom competitor. I won't mention the name, but Steve, if you Google Steve is famous for having started a record label called TVT Records, where he discovered 9 Inch Nails and Ja Rule and Lil Jon and the East Side Boys and Pitbull. None of them have a lot of good things to say about Steve. I like Steve, just the way he's a little bit rough around the edges. He's not afraid to tell people what they feel. So if you guys want to pick up a cool docuseries or haven't seen it already, there's a docuseries called The Defiant Ones, which is about Dr. Dre and Jimmy Iovine. And in episode 3, there's a whole like 10-minute vignette about Steve and 9 Inch Nails, because Steve told Trent Reznor, who's the lead singer of 9 Inch Nails, "You ruined what could have been a great career," because Pretty Hate Machine, which is probably their most successful album ever, he called it an abortion. So worth picking up. That was my boss for 18 months, because he was starting a Zoom competitor and he wanted me to come in and build the sports division. So I did that. And while I was there, I was sort of getting my feet wet back with, producing media in sports specifically. And I ended up getting close with Pete Rose. For those that are unfamiliar with this audience, Pete Rose is very famous in baseball. not only for having the most hits in the history of the game, but for being banned for life for gambling on the game. And so I am the guy to credit or to blame for having developed and sold Pete Rose's gambling podcast, which you can now listen to, but I take no credit for anymore because the creative's out of my hands. But I did that in 2018. So this is 2018 now. And literally right after the Supreme Court struck down PASPA and made sports wagering basically legal in the states, or up to the states to legalize, I did that, spun it into a production company where I worked with guys like Ozzie Guillen, who's famously the manager of the White Sox when they won the World Series. Spice Adams, who Jimmy and I were just talking about. Spice, you don't know him by name probably unless you follow him on Instagram, but he's a 10-year NFL veteran, but is much more famous for making funny content on the internet. And so if you Google Spice Adams Tree, if you don't know him by name, you'll definitely know him by meme. So I worked with him. I work with Nick Mangold, who was a center for the New York Jets, and David Falk, who was a super agent before that even was a term, and is single-handedly responsible for creating the Air Jordan brand because he was Michael Jordan's agent for a very long time. So went from there, started the production company, developed podcasts, TV shows, docuseries around prominent sports figures. The highlights are the ones that I mentioned. And then somewhere along the way, I had different fits and starts with different entrepreneurial endeavors. I was in a startup incubator in 2019 called Antler. So I was in their first US cohort where I was getting paid to start a new company from the ground up, which, to get this plane back on course here about esports, I promise this all has this will all come together. When I was there, this is when I started looking into esports as a business. So one of the things that I looked at as a business was creating an insurance product for esports teams, specifically to insure player contracts. So still something I plan on doing at some point. But that was my first foray into it explicitly. Didn't end up pursuing it in the context of the incubator because it was not necessarily a venture backable business. Ended up starting a legal tech product, or hacking together a legal tech product that was designed to translate legal documents into legalese, which I still think is a good idea. That didn't get funded, and somewhere along the way, this is late 2019, I was like, well, I should probably figure out something to give myself some financial runway here. And it turns out I had this very monetizable skill in being a lawyer, and I passed the bar. I became admitted to the bar. So I never thought of practicing. And then, I had all these friends that I was working with entrepreneurially that said, hey, you're a lawyer. Can you do X, Y, and Z? And I said, sure. I've always done these things for myself, but I guess I can do it. And then those became my first clients. And that was 3 years ago. And I bought a $9 domain name, which I feel married to at this point. Still makes me cringe. I think all the names I give anything make me cringe. But if you understand my story, you understand why I guess it's apropos or fitting. And in between, so let's fast forward up to now. In between, I had different forays and different businesses, but always kept the law practice going and growing. Most recently, I got very, very close to buying a motorsports team in the Formula E Championship last year, until that fell apart in dramatic fashion, like right after Christmas, when our billionaire fashion investor decided to pull out via email at 9 p.m. the day after Christmas, which I thought was a pretty cowardly move. I won't name his name on the air, but I'm happy to talk about it in generalities. And then in 2020, I got asked to, right before COVID, develop a course at NYU, which was for high school students originally, which was called Esports Business and Culture. And so I built that course myself. And then in late 2020, they asked me to teach the Business of Esports, a class called the Business of Esports. I know this is the podcast called the Business of Esports.
Which you'll appreciate is trademarked.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, that's between you and NYU. I didn't pick the name. So I do appreciate.
I'll write them a letter.
With me here.
Yeah, I do appreciate it. I take, again, that's between you and them, not me. Yeah, don't shoot the messenger or the professor. But so I taught that class and different variations of it for the better part of 2-3 years. And that's really where like that became a big part of my brand. And, I think we've done a lot of good things with that class. Students of mine created basically product concepts that were responses to big problems in esports, in conjunction with big names that you've probably heard of, like Activision Blizzard, Microsoft, 2K, Take-Two Interactive. I've had Strauss Zelnick, who's the CEO of Take-Two, in my class. So like it's a laundry list of people that have been through my class at NYU. And then I started doing a lot more writing about this, originally for Forbes for several years, covering the intersection of sports, esports, tech, law, and entrepreneurship. And now I do the same for Boardroom. And then these days, like my two primary buckets or hats that I wear right now are, of course, teaching at NYU, where, of course, I teach and taught the business of esports, which I think they'll probably have to consider changing that name now. And then my law practice, which has grown precipitously. And, I work with a lot of clients in sports and technology and startups, crypto, and also gaming and esports. So, my clients range from people that you guys know about, and even the guy that introduced us, to like Jeff Donnelly and mega fans, to a greenlit TV show called Pangea Cup, which is basically going to be the American Idol for independent game developers, to big NFT projects that you've heard of. Like I did a lot of the IP work for Punk's Comics, which raised about $100 million. I represent the aforementioned Spice Adams. Just a handful to give you a sense of like who I deal with, what I do for them, etc. So that's the spiel. I even left some things out, but be careful what you wish for, because I gave you more and then some, I think.
Daniel, I love it, and I know our audience is going to love the story. I want to dig a bit deeper though on the traditional sports stuff, because a lot of your background's in traditional sports. It's obvious just from the way you talk about it. There's real passion about traditional sports, or what we call meat sports on this podcast. How much difference and similarity do you see from an education perspective and from a business perspective? Because I think you have both. You in particular have both lenses, right? Like you yourself have a degree in sports business, and then you also teach the business of esports, and you yourself have worked in traditional sports and have worked in and around esports, right? And so I'm curious, what similarities that you see, what differences do you see? It's a recurring theme on this podcast, and a recurring sort of debate, which is how much should esports be borrowing from traditional sports in terms of structure, thinking, business models, etc. I would love your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of similarities, and there's a lot of there's more and more overlap these days, especially if you think about who the stakeholders are, right? So a big part of the way I taught my course at NYU, or teach my course at NYU, is by comparing the two, because they are very similar in a lot of ways, but of course they're very different. So just as a for instance, right, I talked about the stakeholders. If you think about these franchise leagues like the Overwatch League or the Call of Duty League, if you look up and down who the owners of those teams are, those are more often than not owners of traditional sports teams, right? You think about like Robert Kraft and Ziggy Wilf and Mickey Arison, who owns the Miami Heat. I mean, the list is very long. Even the owners of the Milwaukee Bucks are involved with their own esports teams, maybe not necessarily in a franchise league. So there's a lot of investment, a lot of like frame of reference and similarity there, especially when we talk about org specifically. But there's of course a lot of differences. So where esports would obviously like to end up is where, for example, the NFL is right now. The NFL, there's 32 teams, and they have massive revenue sharing as a result of how lucrative and coveted the broadcast product is, right? Like I think it's about $300 million each team makes every year in the NFL before they sell a hot dog, sell a ticket, sell a sponsorship, whatever. And that's just because the media rights just are worth more and more money. But esports isn't the same, right? And I don't need to tell you guys, I need to tell your audience this, like to imagine that esports is going to have that sort of media rights revenue that traditional sports has at that scale. I don't think is going to happen anytime soon, if at all, just because there are too many titles, right? And the overlap between who are fans of one title and who are fans of another title is nominal, if at all, right? Like there's a big difference between Rocket League fans and Counter-Strike fans. As a for instance, they might not even care about each other. So there's a lot of games, which makes media rights really tough. But the thing that all these audiences understand, or at least the subsidizers of these audiences understand, is live is still live, and live is really important, and live is still very much important for esports. Whether streaming of actual matches or streaming of other kinds of content, right? Like it's so interesting because the Yankees just play baseball, but your esports, like Team Liquid has like 11 different teams, right? They'll have a CS:GO team, they'll have a Dota 2 team, etc. So it's like the Yankees having a team in Major League Baseball and in the NFL and in the NBA and in MLS and in like 15 other games. And that's really hard. And the economics of org specifically are really difficult. So yeah, there's a lot of similarities. I think sponsorship being such the main revenue driver is tenuous, right? Specifically for orgs. But esports is not just about orgs, right? Esports is part of a bigger ecosystem, which is the video game industry. And the video game industry is, like, I'm sure you guys have said this on this podcast so many times or ad nauseum, is bigger than Hollywood, music, and probably even sports combined. So, it's nascent. It's trying to find its footing, specifically from like a business model economic standpoint. There are some similarities between traditional sports, but to try and use that same blueprint of traditional sports is going to be tough. We can get into specifics about like geography and why that doesn't matter, and the provincial nature of traditional sports. But I gave you a lot there. You can pick up which any of the things that I just mentioned.
I mean, Daniel, I'm so tempted to go at you with sort of the greatest, I'll call them the greatest hits questions that come out on this podcast. But before I go, because I want to ask you about geography, that's an interesting one, right? Like franchise leagues that are city-based versus, esports leagues that are not city-based at all, like mostly anything. Well, League of Legends has some geography to it, but you don't have the, Milwaukee, whatever, fill in the blank. I want to just touch on the ownership thing, because you mentioned especially with Activision Blizzard leagues, which is true, a lot of the owners are owners of traditional sports teams as well. What, in your mind, was the impetus for those people to invest in esports leagues? Because this is, again, a common debate we've had on the podcast, which is it them playing defense because, they think, well, what if this esports thing takes off and, it's a threat to us, so we'll invest in it, even though maybe we don't really believe in it. We'll have it sort of there just in case. Or do you feel like more of it was offensive, where a lot of these owners see the future, see where attention's going, see where industries are going, and are investing for the future? Or is this purely a bubble where Bobby Kotick knew a lot of sports team owners and sold them on esports franchises? Not A or B sort of don't apply here.
Yeah, I don't think it is like offensive or defensive. I think it's like reactive versus proactive. And I think we see this in a lot of different industries. It's not like esports and gaming is not unique to this. Did you guys go to South by Southwest this year?
No,
didn't.
Okay, so if you were at South by Southwest this year, you would understand that there's one very, very prevalent and common theme, which is that like everyone is trying to shoehorn blockchain and or Web3 into a concept, and by doing that, I think it makes it a good business or a good idea.
I mean, that's not a South by Southwest phenomenon. Just to be clear, that's every conference I've been to.
No, yeah, 100%. I'm just saying, like, it was very obvious there. And then, like, I always like to say this. I don't know if you guys are comedy fans or remember Robin Williams stand up, but Robin Williams used to say that cocaine was God's way of saying you have too much money. And I think like Web3 and blockchain, the money that's been thrown around in that space specifically is a for instance of like, yeah, we've got too much money and the economy's overheated. Specifically NFTs, but like that's an aside. So what I'm saying is
it's a solution looking for a problem is the way I usually frame it.
Absolutely. Totally agree. And so like I think esports was exactly like that, because so investors didn't really understand it completely, but there was a good frame of reference for it, right? Like, okay, people want to watch PGA Tour golfers or NFL because they want to see someone at the peak of what they're doing and do things that they can't do, and that's entertaining. And I think the same is true, of course, with like watching other people play video games and watching people play at the highest level of these different esports and gaming titles. So I think if you were to go to like 2015, 2016, there were a couple big inflection points, right? Like League of Legends World selling out Madison Square Garden and the Staples Center, like within a very short span of time, got a lot of people's attention. And funny enough, I think it's like the sons and daughters and children of all of these people that have wealth were like, "Oh, my kids are really into this. There must be something to it. Let's invest in it." But like the thesis wasn't so well formed because it was so early on. Like for example, if you're Bob Kraft and you own the New England Patriots, which is a multi-billion-dollar franchise, and someone comes to you and says, "Well, you have an opportunity to get in the ground floor of the Call of Duty League, and like it's an esport." So like all these buzzwords check the boxes for them, and there's only going to be a finite amount, which means there's scarcity. They were like, "Okay, we'll put $20 million into a slot. We'll put whatever it's going to take to capitalize to run the team and take losses on the chin." But the whole economics of sports in general, sports teams in general, is that it's not a cash flow hand over fist business. Like even the best teams like the Yankees barely scratch by and make a profit. A lot of them lose money on a cash flow basis. It's about the enterprise value of the organization increasing over time because of scarcity.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of, for like franchise leagues specifically, they made that bet based upon their understanding and them having of traditional sports and the similarity thereof, and being able to say, well, we made money on enterprise value with our own team. So I think the same will be true with esports. But to land this plane, like I don't think that that's going to end up holding true, because it's going to be a really long road to hoe. Because one, of course, as you guys know, like no one owns the game of football, but somebody owns Call of Duty, right? Like that's protected by copyright. And the developer and publisher, Activision Blizzard, now Microsoft, depending on how that merger goes through, is going to have, and it has an outsized role, an outsized amount of influence in every aspect of the sport. So that's a problem. And then it's titles, as you guys know, some of them have had staying power for a decade, multiple decades, but there's always the next one that's coming around the corner. And so it's always like, oh, who do you bet on, and what's the fundamentals of this business, right? The fundamentals of esports is not media rights; it's sponsorship right now, and who knows if it'll ever be media rights. So you need people that are willing to basically figure out the business side and how to make money outside of the low-hanging fruit, which is predominantly sponsorship. And if you're like 100 Thieves and organizations like that, merch. So yeah.
Well, we had Arnold from Genji. Jimmy, I don't know if that's where you were going to go.
No, follow your train of thought. I was going to change us. So yeah, let's keep going with this one.
His view was sale of digital assets like skins and things and splitting those with the team. That's what sort of gets you out of what he called like esports winter right now, right? Where sponsorship barely pays the bills and media rights isn't there yet. And so for the time being, in his mind, the best choice, and I'm putting words in his mouth and I'm paraphrasing here, but the best option was sort of selling digital goods and splitting that revenue stream with the teams themselves. I don't know if you agree with that, Dan, but I'm curious to get your thoughts there.
Oh no, I think that's actually that's probably the one under, like if you guys follow Newzoo at all, I think that's the one undercounted revenue stream, right? Like that's the whole free to play business model, is that there's no barrier to entry, so anyone can pick it up. And then if you can upsell a finite amount of a certain percentage of your player base to be able to buy skins and digital goods and items or loot boxes, etc., there's a really profitable business to the tune of billions of dollars a year, depending on what your scale is. And so I think a lot of digital goods, whether they be NFTs or tokens or what have you, tend to be pretty bunk because they don't really get you anything, right? They don't really, there's no inherent value to them. We're all part of a big social experiment. When it comes to digital assets, about like, what does it take? What do we find value in, and what does it take to make a market, and what does it take to sustain a market and prop it up? But I think for the longest time, like even before NFTs really came on the scene, gaming has always been the first like breeding ground, testing ground where people have been willing to invest in things that aren't tangible, but they get something out of, right? It's not an investment per se, like a financial investment with an expectation of return. It's an investment in your experience in the game. And it's an investment, in this case, in the team and in the org. And I think you have a consumer base that's like way more attuned and way more familiar and comfortable with buying quote unquote digital goods and anything. So I think that's, if not the best, one of the better ways to think about monetizing esports writ large outside of like the traditional routes.
Jimmy, sorry, I don't know what direction you wanted to take.
Yeah, no, thank you. I was waiting for you guys to wrap up. I definitely wanted to jump in here just because we have Dan for a limited amount of time, and there's so much that you've done in your career and so many topics we could honestly tackle. I didn't want to omit or leave out something that I found personally interesting. I mean, Dan and I connected obviously over both, the three of us here, honestly, all teaching esports at various universities. And our class just started at UCI a couple weeks ago. Dan, I'm curious the top questions or issues that you can spot with regard to your student body, what they're asking, what they're looking for help, and the advice that you typically give them. Something that I could possibly share with my own class, that Paul can share with his, that our listeners that are, we have a lot that are working in gaming and in esports, but a lot of them are always looking also to enter into the industry. So I just wanted to shift the conversation and get a little bit of your professor type experience and expertise before we run out of time.
No, that's fine. And I got as much time as you guys have, so that's fine because I'm not eating today for holiday reasons. So I kind of feel like, in a lot of ways, I kind of feel like a fraud relative to my students, because you're talking about a generation that grew up not watching TV, but grew up on Twitch and grew up on YouTube and on social media, and so this is these are their heroes. This is their this is what they eat, eat, sleep, and breathe. So I feel like I learned way more from my students just from a cultural standpoint about like what it means to be for these people to be your heroes, for this to be your main form of entertainment, etc. From a business standpoint, as far as like how do you get in, that's really 50% or more of my class, right? So I meet for once a week, 2.5 hours a week. So it's a lot of time to fill, and hopefully this is somewhat interesting to whoever's listening to this, but no one needs to hear me talk for 2.5 hours. And so what I've always made my business of doing is having awesome guests, not because it does anything for me or I like to name check them, but because, you only get so many opportunities to have effectively a warm introduction to somebody and make an impression on somebody. And I want to be able to create that for all my students. And so it's not necessarily a question that I get asked. I just know it's something that they want to figure out a way to break in. And I know I can lead them so far, but I know, when I bring in Strauss Zelnick, or when I bring in JMR Luna from Team OG, or when I bring in Fatality, Jonathan Wendell, or any of these people, it's not for me, right? It's for them. And so the question I always ask every guest that I bring into my class is, what's the best way to get a hold of you these days? So there's an opportunity to make a connection. So I think it's really, it's like sports and esports. I think they're the same in that, like, it's a very opaque industry for those that aren't on the inside. And it's like, how do you get in? There's a lot of theory that's taught in school about like, oh, do you understand how this works at a very, very high level? But I really like to structure any class with a deliverable or with an outcome being an answer to the show me what you've done, don't tell me what you want to do. Because like when you're at the precipice of a career, it doesn't really matter. Like, you talk is great, but actually show me something that you've done. And for my students, it's twofold, right? It's being able to have them make great connections, and two, being able to have a deliverable that says, I really grappled with this real world problem, and this is what I came up with, and it's something to talk about in an interview or in a conversation, etc. So I think it's a good question for our field. It's not like specific questions as much as it's sort of actions and the way I structure things to enable them to get their foot in the door. So, yeah.
Daniel, I mean, but that brings me sort of to a follow-up question, because I think this is a good sort of line of thinking here. A lot of the pushback I've heard around just esports, call it education in general, because a lot of schools have popped up. Jimmy teaches an esports business class, or a few esports, and I used to, I teach at St. Peter's in New Jersey, and there's a lot of these programs around esports
really?
business.
You teach at St. Peter's in New Jersey, in Jersey City, like the ones that made the run into. That's awesome.
And where people, I think, push back a little bit is this sort of a degree in and of itself, right? Like, can you major in esports business, right? Or is it really just a business degree with some esports context? And I'm curious how you look at it, right? Like, is it truly its own thing that people can, should be able to major in and specialize in, and there's enough content there that is esports specific? Or is it really like, I'm teaching you marketing and the 4 Ps, but I'm using examples that are esports examples? Like, how do you look at esports education in that sense?
I think it's the latter. I think esports is a very, like, it's, first of all, if you ask Red Eye, like, there's only one way to spell it. Not everyone knows how to spell it. 1, 2, it's become very buzzwordy, and 3, I think we're really talking about competitive video games. And so the one thing I always say is that every esport is a video game, but not every video game has an esport. And so what you're learning is effectively the business of gaming. And if you zoom out more, you're learning about the business of entertainment. And if you look at the statistics, it's the most popular form of entertainment in the world. And so that is what I would consider, what it is that you're actually learning. I think actually the branding does a disservice, because it becomes like a very sneery applause line for politicians, especially when you talk about student debt, right? Like, I think, don't talk about religion, don't talk about politics. But Amy Klobuchar, who's the senator from Minnesota, said in, like, the Democratic presidential debates about what's wrong with our education system is people are taking out a ton of debt to major in sports marketing. Okay, fine, whatever. Like, I think some of the branding does a disservice, because it's hard to convey to employers or the market, what exactly it is that you're doing. But I think if you demystify, like, I also teach sports law, right? But what am I teaching in sports law? I'm teaching contracts, and I'm teaching torts, and I'm teaching corporations and all those things. It's just the subject matter happens to be sports. I think the same is true for esports, or whether it's a class you're taking or a degree, you're learning about an industry, but you're also learning about fundamentals of business. And I think that's something we don't do as an industry very well. We don't do very well as an industry in terms of branding, so that, like, people, whether that be parents, students, and specifically employers, understand that. But it's really a head fake. So, and the last thing I'll say about it is, like, another terrible question I get asked as a lawyer is, like, when you tell someone you're a lawyer, the first question you always ask is, what kind of lawyer are you? And I always go, the best kind. But in reality, right, like, there's a guy named Frank Easterbrook, who's a judge, federal judge, who was a professor at the University of Chicago, who wrote this thing called The Law of the Horse, or this law review article called The Law of the Horse. It's worth a Google. Like, the first 2 pages are interesting. The rest is very technical. But it's essentially like, there is no such thing as the law of the horse. It's an amalgamation of different areas of law. And there's no such thing as, like, an esports degree. It's just an amalgamation of different areas of business, but you're learning about an industry. You're becoming an expert in an industry, while also learning the fundamentals, blocking and tackling of a business. So as long as that balance is correct, I think that's fine. I think branding is a big issue, though.
I love it. I think super insightful. That brings us to everyone's favorite segment, what we call Judge Jimmy's cross-examination. Daniel, you'll appreciate this. The way this works for anyone who's new to the podcast is Jimmy's going to ask a few rapid-fire questions, get to know Daniel, you as a person, as a gamer, a bit more. They're easy questions. They're rapid-fire questions. Judge Jimmy, take it away.
All right, Dan, we'll keep it easy on you. First one, what is your favorite video game of all time?
That's a good question. Madden has to be a good answer. Default answer for me because it's the one you could find me playing at all times, even though it fundamentally hasn't changed in forever.
All right. Madden, I think definitely a fan favorite for a lot of people.
But like,
Let's go
I love
on.
Mario Kart for Wii, and then I think our internet's getting a little bit choppy. You guys with me still?
I got you, Dan. Yeah, it was just a minute there. Keep going.
No, I would say yeah. So I definitely the quick version is Madden default, Mario Kart, and I'm looking forward to the reboot of the PGA 2K game. Now they got Tiger Woods involved.
Cool.
Oh yeah, definitely looking forward to that one. Any games you're playing currently? I would imagine something along the similar lines.
It's funny. Like I said, this is part of why I feel like I'm a fraud, because I've got, by virtue of all the hats that I wear, it's hard to find time to play anything. Did you guys know that when you have the no internet, I just learned this. I was today years old when I learned this. Did you guys know that when you have the no internet screen on Chrome, that dinosaur, if you click the spacebar, it's a game?
I did not know that.
Yeah, I didn't know that. You guys got to try it. It's actually super fun. So like when I'm in the
this is the game you're playing currently. The no internet screen.
No, I mean because I've been for the holidays coming back and forth to Jersey to my parents' house, and the internet, as you guys just saw, it tends to be spotty at times. So I'm seeing that screen more often. And you click the space bar, and the dinosaur actually jumps, and you jump over stuff. So I mean that's technically a game, so we'll count it, right?
It is a game, and you're a gamer. That's cool.
Definitely counts. Let's get you one more question. This might be loaded, so I'll keep it as the last one. Just considering what you've done and your perspective on things that we're learning today. What is your favorite adaptation of original IP that transcends both gaming, film, whatever medium you choose, but your favorite IP that you've seen in gaming culture as well as outside of gaming culture?
That's a good one. Was it Jumanji? Was Jumanji actually originally a board game?
I've watched the movies, but I
yeah.
never played the board game. I don't know if they made the game after the movie or before. Sharing my ignorance there.
Yeah. So if I would, I would default into Jumanji if I could make that an answer. I haven't watched the new Halo show. I did not watch Mortal Kombat. Lara Croft Tomb Raider, I think, is probably a really good example. Yeah, there's probably a way better one that's coming down the pike. What I really want to do, and this is a plug, and I don't know where he stands with it, but what I really want to do, what I've been working on, is like I really want to do almost like an entourage for around a professional gaming character, with Fatality being the or Jonathan Wendell, i.e. Fatality, being like the main influence. Because I don't know, I'm sure you guys know a little bit about his story, but it's amazing, and he's got all of the swag of like a traditional athlete, and the record to back it up. So I think there's a lot. Anyway, so I'm almost plugging myself, but that's something I want to do and I want to see. Because I don't think one of the things I think that's missing in the market right now. I took this far afield. One of the things I think is missing in the market is that, like, I think there were like TV mainstream media adaptations of, let's say, startup life that made it cool. Like, I don't know if you guys remember The Social Network, which was the Facebook movie, and Silicon Valley.
Silicon Valley. Yeah.
Yeah,
Paul loves that show.
I think there's.
I think that's basically my life. So
Yeah, so I haven't watched Mythic Quest. I love Rob McElhenney. I think
Mythic Quest is really good.
So if I watch Mythic Quest, like I think that would probably be my answer, like the best answer. But I'll take Rob McElhenney and Megan Gans on faith that like they do a really good job with that show. But I do think that there needs to be a Silicon Valley and a social network type feature length film that takes gaming in a more like paints it in a more serious light. So yeah. Anyway, so there's a lot of answers, but I'd like to see more. And I think if there were to be like a Silicon Valley for gaming and a social network for gaming, then those would be my answers.
Nice. Paul, just so you know, because I know you're also a Community fan like I am, Danny Pudi, who plays Abed on Community, is a main character on Mythic Quest as well on Apple TV+. So for any Community fans that are listening, you guys know I share it. I'm super excited for the movie that they put back in development, but just a little fun anecdote there. Well, that wraps up Judge Jimmy's cross-examination. Dan, thanks so much for coming on the show, giving you back to Paul.
Dan, for those who want to follow what you're doing, or reach out to you or find you, how do you like to be followed or found?
I don't like to be followed quite literally, but if you guys want to check me, I mean, like I'm all over the place. So I'm at Dan Marcus Tweets on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn if you look for Daniel Marcus and Hustle Law. You can read what I write at boardroom.tv. So that's Kevin Durant's media platform where I do cover some esports stuff. And if you are someone thinking about, if you're a younger person or if you're a parent thinking about a career in this space, just Google Daniel Marcus NYU and you'll find a lot of the stuff that I've done in academia. So that's me. Those are my shameless plugs. And you can always email me at Dan, D-A-N, at hustle, H-U-S-T-L-E, law, L-A-W, group, GROUP.com. Not everyone puts their email out there. I don't know why not. It just seems like a smart thing to do.
Yeah, you're right. I think everyone has considered it like too old-fashioned now, but I agree. It's the easiest way. Dan, look, we could have done 6 more episodes with you. There's just so much to talk about. I really appreciate having you on the show. I know our audience is going to love this. Jimmy, thank you as always. Just a couple of reminders for our listeners. Make sure to follow Business of Esports everywhere. You can get all kinds of content on all platforms, on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube, on Spotify. Like we put different content on every single platform, on LinkedIn, obviously. So make sure to follow Business of Esports, Biz Esports everywhere. And don't forget to tell your friends about the podcast and the live show we do every Wednesday evening, or every Wednesday afternoon, I should say, 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. It's evening for me, but it's 2:30 p.m. Eastern time every single Wednesday. We do a live show. We cover all the news from the week. It's a lot of fun. It's a bigger cast, and you get to participate live and disagree with me or disagree with Jimmy or agree with us and get in our faces. So we encourage you to come out every Wednesday, 2:30 p.m. Eastern time on all the platforms we stream on. So you can find this pretty much everywhere. And don't forget, guys, the most important thing, the future is fun. We'll see you next week.